Hi everybody, and welcome to PanKind's EmpowerEd webinar, all about clinical trials. My name is Sophia Casbolt and I'm PanKind's Program Manager. Thank you so much for joining us today. So I just have a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. I need to let you know that the information presented in this webinar is of a general nature and should not be considered personal or medical advice. Always seek independent advice relevant to your specific situation. The opinions of the presenters are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of PanKind. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties during the webinar, please let us know via the chat box, or you can email me at sophia@pankind.org.au. A recording of the webinar will be available from our website, pankind.org.au, and only those presenting on screen today will be in the recording. During this webinar, attendees' mics and cameras will be off. So I'll just take you through our agenda today. The lovely Dr. Caroline Lee will be presenting, and as the title suggests, it will be all about clinical trials, what they are, how they work, and how they can be beneficial when you've been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. She'll also discuss how to find out about clinical trials and how to know if they might work for you. So as I've mentioned, our presenter for today is Dr. Caroline Lee, but I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce her more properly. Caroline Lee is the Program Manager at the Australian Pancreatic Cancer Centre at Epworth in Melbourne. Caroline is a clinical researcher with a background in cancer biology and pharmacology. She specialises in research translation and research strategy. Caroline completed her PhD and postdoctoral fellowship at Monash University, where her preclinical research looking into the effects of chronic stress on cancer spread was translated into a phase 2 clinical trial at the Peter MacCallum Cancer Centre. Caroline currently manages a portfolio of 20-plus pancreas-focused research studies and clinical trials run by the Australian Pancreatic Cancer Centre at Epworth. Welcome, Caroline, and thank you so much for presenting today. I'll just pop your slides up so you can begin.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sophia, for the kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation to present today. As Sophia mentioned, I'm Caroline. I am the Program Manager of the Australian Pancreatic Centre at Epworth, and today I'd like to talk to you about clinical trials in a general sense, but also to give you a few tips and tricks as to, if you are interested in a clinical trial, how to work out which one's the best one for you, and give you the tools that you may need to make that decision. So you've kindly put aside some time today to attend this webinar, and so I feel like I need to tell you a little bit about myself and why I find myself, or how I find myself here today. So who am I? I am a scientist by training, and I started my research career about 15 years ago in basic research. So what does basic research mean? And I use this graph. I wouldn't be a scientist if I didn't put up at least one graph to visualize, the trajectory of kind of my career and how I've come to be where I am, and how the knowledge that I've gained along the way will hopefully be useful to you today. So basic research, as you can see here, is really at the start of the different models of cancer drug discovery. And as you can see, as you're going across the different models, you go from basic research, translational research, and clinical research. The complexity gets infinitely larger. And so I've finished my undergraduate degree in biotechnology and pharmaceutical sciences. And at the time when I graduated, I realized fairly quickly that I liked to work with my hands, and I liked to understand how things worked rather than what the end goal was. I liked to understand the processes, and I liked to understand the nuances. And so I knew fairly quickly that I wanted to get into research. And this was one of the covers of Time magazine the year that I graduated. Stem cells were all the rage. They were the next big thing. As you can see there, stem cells can save your life. And so I really wanted to understand more about stem cells and be involved in this new wave of new technology. There were only a few labs in Australia at the time that were doing stem cell research, and one of those was at the Monash Institute of Pharmaceutical Sciences in Melbourne. So I joined that lab there, did my honours research, and after a year of learning how to grow stem cells into neurons, we were looking at ways to treat treat Parkinson's disease. I had good days where I would create neurons and brain cells to treat Parkinson's disease, and then on bad days I was creating, heart cells, skin cells, eye cells, and so it dawned on me pretty quickly that this research being translated into the clinical setting was a fair ways away. And so I started to look at how I could get a little bit closer to seeing this research, or seeing my research in general, be applied in the clinical setting. And so at the time I finished this project in stem cell research, a new researcher by the name of Erica Sloan had just moved back from the States after a stint there at UCLA, and she was starting a lab looking at a very interesting concept of how chronic stress affects cancer. And so I did my PhD with Dr. Erica Sloan, looking at modeling chronic stress in animal models to see how that affected cancer spread, particularly in breast cancer. And so that was the link from me moving from basic research to what they call translational research, which is in usually animal models. In my case, it was mouse models, and trying to understand or take it one step closer to something that is representative of, the end goal, which is being able to help patients with pancreatic cancer. And so I did my PhD in chronic stress and breast cancer for about 3 years, and managed to publish that research. It got a lot of media attention, which is fantastic. So it got picked up by The Age, as you can see there. I had my few minutes of fame there on News Breakfast with Michael Rowland and Virginia Trioli, talking about what that research meant. We even had an episode of The Catalyst looking at our research. But in those discussions, what became very evident for me, and some of the questions often led to, okay, well, when is this going to apply, in the clinic, in the hospital? Do we have a drug that can treat this? And so we started the discussion with some of our colleagues over at the Peter MacCallum Cancer Centre about, right, we have done all of this basic research. We want to translate it into the hospital, but as scientists, this is where our work finishes. And so we were very fortunate to have some great collaborators at Peter Mac take this research on and turn it into a phase 2 clinical trial, as Sophia mentioned. So this study was run at Peter Mac to look at ways of stopping that chronic stress signaling from affecting patients with breast cancer. And that's really where I developed my desire and my motivation into looking at clinical trials and clinical research, and how we can translate this really great basic research and translational research into something impactful in the hospital. And so we talked about now what this transition looks like from basic research to translational research and clinical research. My apologies. So that's really, I know that's where I wanted to go, and that's where I was really striving to move towards. And so I found an opportunity at Epworth in 2018, looking at clinical trial research and translating some fantastic basic science into clinical trials, and joined the team in 2018. And then this is where I found myself at the Drosati Pancreatic Centre, where it was launched in 2021, really looking at bringing together various specialties and like-minded people to try to really forge a way of finding new ways to detect, diagnose and treat pancreatic cancer. And so that's where I find myself here at the Australian Pancreatic Centre at Epworth. And so we talked about these transition of basic research to clinical research, and that translates quite nicely into what you may all be quite familiar with in terms of the different phases of research. And so I'm sure you've all heard of, phase 1, 2, 3, 4 clinical trials, but what does it actually mean? And so if I can take a few minutes here to walk through these very briefly. Early discovery and ongoing preclinical research is essentially what I was talking about before, and where I spent a lot of my earlier years running research projects in the lab, in cells or in animals, really trying to understand the mechanisms of various processes. Why do cancer cells behave the way that they do? Why do they not respond to certain drugs? How can we, interfere with certain processes that make them so resistant to chemotherapy, for instance? When we move to phase 1 clinical trials, these trials are often quite small. They, as outlined there, have 1 to 2 dozen participants usually, and they're usually tested or wanting to test a new treatment, whether it be a device or a medication, in healthy controls or healthy volunteers to see whether it's safe. And that is the prime goal of a phase 1 clinical trial, is to see if it is safe. This is where they will also determine the right dose. So essentially testing a drug for the first time in healthy individuals and seeing what the right dose is to make sure that they can balance the effectiveness of the medication or the drug with potential side effects. Now, these clinical trials often, because they are looking at safety, require overnight stays with a lot of safety monitoring for good reason, and with a lot of blood and tissue sample collection, because they're really wanting to understand how that drug is being absorbed by the body, but also whether there are going to be any reactions or any side effects. Phase 2 clinical trials are a little bit larger, so they're usually under 100 participants, and they are really there to check the benefits of a new treatment and the effects of those new treatments. They also check the ongoing safety of the medication and how that treatment should be used, in what context should it be used. These studies can often be randomized control studies where you have a cohort of participants and a certain number of them will receive a new treatment type that they're testing, and then the other cohort will receive standard of care that they would otherwise receive. And so what they're really trying to understand is whether whatever it is that they're testing is actually going to benefit and add on to what the standard of care is. And this is what I really want to make sure is clearly outlined here, is that clinical trials, particularly in cancer treatments, there is always a baseline of standard of care. They will never take away what the standard of care treatment is for whatever the cohort is. And so for the most part, it is chemotherapy. So these trials will always have chemotherapy as an underlying, this is what is going to happen. However, we want to see whether this new drug or device on top of this standard of care will provide a benefit. And then we have phase 3 trials, and these trials are a lot larger, often more than 100 participants in terms of an entire cohort. And these studies are really the last step before moving a certain device or a medication into public use. And so what this phase of clinical trials is looking at is to see whether the medication, or how much the medication is effective. So if you remember phase 2, it is about what effect it has, but now in phase 3, it's really understanding the context and how effective it is. And it also, obviously, throughout all of these trials, wants to monitor long-term safety. So these studies are a little bit more long-term, can also be randomized control, but are much larger and wanting to look really in the long run how these medications and interventions work over a number of years. And then phase 4 is they're not particularly, you don't come across them particularly often. And these trials are usually created or run once a certain treatment is already approved by the public. And so this form of trial does still check the effectiveness of a treatment. It monitors long-term safety, but it does so while the treatment is already on the market and that it is freely accessible to the public. Now, this was an overview with some nuances there throughout the different phases of clinical trials. I will come back to this a little bit later. So there are some nuances here that I've emphasized for good reason, I promise, because I'll refer to them later when we go through, what's involved in choosing the best clinical trial for you. So in the context of pancreatic cancer, you're usually seeing studies in this orange square here. And the reason why I have it sitting right in the middle of phase 1 is that, as if you remember when I discussed phase 1, they're usually in healthy volunteers. Now, if you can imagine for a new treatment that is looking at its effect in treating pancreatic cancer, they can't test that in healthy individuals. And so there's a bit of a gray area here where some phase 1 trials are actually done or conducted in a context where they can accept patients with pancreatic cancer because that's the only way that they can test its safety. And so we can have some phase 1, what they call 1B clinical trials. You have the phase 2 clinical trials and the phase 3 clinical trials that are the ones that you'll see the most when searching for clinical trials in the context of pancreatic cancer. So searching for clinical trials, how do you find clinical trials? And I wish I had a very simple, straightforward answer for you, but as you can imagine, I don't. And so there are a number of ways that you can search for clinical trials. They all have their pros and their cons. All clinical trials that are testing something that is a treatment, particularly in cancer, have to be by law registered to some form of registry. There is no mandate as to which registry, but they have to be publicly available for the general public to look up, and for clinicians and physicians to look up should they need. So I've put a number of registries and portals up here. This by no means is an extensive list, but has a pretty good coverage of most of the clinical trials that you'll find out there, again, particularly in pancreatic cancer. You have clinicaltrials.gov, which is a US base but has a really broad reach of all the clinical trials running across the world and also Australia. The downside with clinicaltrials.gov is that it can be overwhelming. It has a lot of information in there and is really useful once you're a little bit further down the track in wanting to understand the nuances of the trial, but can be quite overwhelming if you're just doing, if you're having a browse and wanting to see what's out there. Something that is a little bit more digestible is the Australian Clinical Trials portal. And so this one obviously is focused on Australian clinical trials and has the information condensed in a way that you can, by just skimming over the page, get a good idea of what the clinical trial is about. We also have the Australian Clinical Trials portal there that's run by the Cancer Australia. We also have the ANZ CTR, which is the Australian New Zealand Clinical Trials Registry, which is also a really great resource. More recently, the World Health Organization has collated and essentially pulled the data of all of these registries and put it into one place. And so this is what born the International clinical trials registry portal. And so this is a relatively new portal. There are still some kinks in there, but is again another great resource to get a good overview of the different clinical trials out there. And then there are more local resources. So we're based in Victoria, and so a lot of our clinical trials that we run at the Australian Pancreatic Centre is listed in the Cancer Council Victoria Victorian Cancer Trials link. So a number of different options there, as I mentioned, all with some pros and some cons depending on what you're looking for. So in terms of searching each of these portals for clinical trials, PanKind have a wonderful outline of how you can do that with really clear step-by-step instructions as to how you can navigate these portals and what to put in to be able to pull out the right information. And so I won't labor the fact because there's a fantastic resource there with PanKind. But what I do want to do is then take you through, once you've done that search, how to actually take in this information and how to filter through a lot of the information there that may be not particularly relevant to you, and really hone in the things that matter for you to decide if this clinical trial is right for you or not. So the first thing that I want to touch on is recruitment status. These registries, as I mentioned, by law, all clinical trials have to be registered onto these registries, but they can often be a little bit out of date. And so when a study is opened, it will register, but then it's for the trial team to go back to this registry and say, hey, okay, we've got an update. You know, this is where we're at in terms of the overall life of the trial. And so what I want to highlight here, the purpose of this slide, is to point you towards the different categories of these trials and how you can understand whether this is actually a trial that is open, that is running, or whether it is something that actually has not opened yet or is already finished. So to the right here, you can see a number of drop-down boxes that talk to the status of a clinical trial when entered onto these registries. You have an option for not yet recruiting. These are studies that are starting up. They need to register these studies onto a registry, but have not yet opened it up to recruitment. Then we've got recruiting. So these are the studies that are open, will take patients on, and are the ones that you're really wanting to look for when you're doing these searches. And then we've got a few other statuses there where you say you have enrolling by invitation. It's active, but not recruiting. What active and not recruiting means, although it may not make sense, it's a study that is open, but is no longer recruiting. So they've hit their recruitment goal, but they are still open because they want to follow these patients through to see whether there are any safety concerns or what the outcomes are. And so the study is technically open, but not recruiting. And then you've got studies that are suspended, terminated, completed, or withdrawn. And so I've got there on the left some examples of what it may look like if you're looking for these clinical trials on the various registries. Now, if I use that top example, you can see that it's not yet recruiting. So it's a study that has just opened. You can see that it was first posted. So when was it first registered? In March of 2023. That's a great sign because it shows that this status is relatively up to date. Now, if I can bring you down to that red example at the bottom, you can see this study is active and not recruiting. And you can see it was first posted in September of 2021. So you can see there's been some time between when they first registered the study and now. And then if you look at the bottom, it says last update posted December of 2022. So it's been a few months now since they've updated it. And so this starts to give you a sense of where the study is and how up to date this information is, and whether you want to follow through with the particular study. Okay, and then the next thing I wanted to touch on is inclusion and exclusion criteria, or what they call eligibility criteria. This is one of the most difficult aspects of reading through a clinical trial and understanding, but is also one of the most crucial parts. Because for inclusion criteria, these are the criteria that you must meet to be considered for a clinical trial. For an exclusion criteria, these are criteria that you must not meet to be considered for a clinical trial. And there are usually, upwards of 15, 20 criteria in each of these that we have to systematically go through to see in an individual patient's circumstance whether they fit for this trial. And these criteria aren't made, as much as it may seem the contrary, they're not made to be difficult, but they're made to protect patients in terms of when they're coming through the trial team has looked at various things that are risky or need to be considered, and they've written that into the inclusion and exclusion criteria to make sure that those who come through are protected and may not be at risk of certain reactions that they are predicting. And then the last thing is phase of trial. So we touched on this before with the different phases, 1, 2, 3, 4. For a phase 1 clinical trial, these trials tend to be more diverse cohorts. So these are trials that are often a little bit more liberal with the eligibility criteria. They have more assessments because if you remember the previous slides, these are studies that are looking at safety. So they have more assessments because they really want to understand the safety profile of this new treatment. And they tend to have fewer spots. So if you remember, these studies are only about a dozen, if not 24 people large in their cohorts. Whereas a phase 3 clinical trial, they have much more specific cohorts because they want to understand in which context this treatment works best. So they're a little bit more strict with their eligibility criteria. They have less assessments because they've cleared up really what the effectiveness is, and they're really honing in on what it is that this drug does. And they have more spots. So they really wanted to expand the cohort, try to see if they can ensure that the effects that they're seeing is applicable to a larger generalizable cohort of patients. So what does this look like in real terms? So if I can spend a minute or two just going through an example of an inclusion criteria, we have here, you have proven, provided written informed consent. So every clinical trial, patients have to provide consent to be involved. These are all voluntary. Of course, you have to be over 18, but here, confirmed histological or cytological diagnosis of advanced pancreatic adenocarcinoma. And so that is, this study will take patients who have essentially metastatic or not resectable pancreatic cancer. In part B, you can see here, this cohort, they're looking at those who have metastatic with their initial diagnosis being within 6 weeks of baseline. So they're very, very, very specific criteria that they're looking for. And so you can see within 6 weeks, you have to make a decision within 6 weeks whether you're wanting to go into this clinical trial or not. And so this is where, as I mentioned, it is extremely overwhelming because there's a lot of information there, but it's very important and crucial if you're wanting to decide whether you want to be part of a clinical trial or not. Exclusion criteria. So if you look again at part A and part B here, they say part A has received prior systemic treatment for pancreatic cancer. So as an exclusion criteria, patients who have had any form of treatment prior, any form of systemic treatment prior, are not eligible for this clinical trial. And then if you see in part B, which is starting to get a little bit more strict, they say that patients who have received no previous radiotherapy, surgery, or chemotherapy are eligible. And so they're really starting to drill down on who they want to assess this medication. So this leads to lines of therapy, and this is a piece of jargon that pops up in these searches. And is frustrating to filter through, but important nonetheless. And so what they mean when they say lines of therapy, it's starting from the left here. You start with a diagnosis and you're untreated or treatment naive, haven't received any treatment. The first form of treatment that a patient receives, that's considered their first line. The second, so let's say for whatever reason, if there are, if a patient reacts to that first form of treatment and has to change to another form, let's say from one form of chemotherapy to another form of chemotherapy, that's now considered a second line. And then subsequently, if we change again, it's considered a third line. Each of those counts as a line of therapy. Now, the reason why I've highlighted this is that a lot of these clinical trials will dictate what line of therapy a patient needs to be at to be eligible for their trial. So another example here we've got in cohort 2B, they need to be in the first line standard of care therapy. So these, to be eligible for this study, you need to have not had any treatment at all. Now you can imagine how difficult that's going to be if you've just been diagnosed, thinking about starting treatment, which you want to do straight away, but to be eligible for a clinical trial, you need to not have started any form of treatment. And so what I want you to take away from this is it's very important to have these discussions early with your medical team about whether you want to be involved in clinical trial, because there's usually a very small window where you can participate. And I just wanted to add a note at the bottom is that for ethical reasons, most cancer clinical trials enroll people with advanced or metastatic disease. They need to balance the potential risks to patients with being able to try to get these drugs into the clinic. And so they need to ensure that patients have every opportunity to receive standard of care before they intervene with something that's new. And so for ethically, most clinical trials are targeted at those who have advanced or metastatic disease. For scientific reasons, though, they want to make sure that they enroll people who have not received prior treatment, because they don't want it to muddy the results of the clinical trial. So you can see there are two kind of conflicting aspects that these trial design, people who are designing these trials are really battling with. The ethical concerns about patients and making sure that we are not interfering with a patient's treatment options, but also trying to have good quality data that they can collect to be able to pass on to into the clinic. The last thing I want to touch on in terms of the searching is that it is really important to try to contact the study team if you're interested in a clinical trial. They would be the best people to talk to about whether this trial is open, whether they are recruiting, whether they are accepting patients at that current time. They will be able to give you the most up-to-date information. And so I've given you some examples of what that section looks like at the various portals. All right, and then lastly, I just want to quickly run through what the process is. So you've done your search for clinical trials. You found a clinical trial that that you're interested in. You're eligible. It suits in terms of your treatment regimen. Your medical team are supportive. What does it now look like if you are to enter this clinical trial? The first stage is pre-screening. And so this involves that initial conversation, either by phone or in the clinic with a member of the study team. And so this conversation is really just for you and the study team to understand what the trial is about, what your needs are, what the trial needs are, and what's required of the trial, and make sure that that's something that is suitable. The next one is informed consent. And this is a crucial part of clinical trials. We are audited on it all the time because it is extremely important that patients do not feel that they are being coerced to participate in a clinical trial, and that they have all the information needed to make informed consent. And this word informed is really important. Consenting is one thing, but having informed consent where you feel as a patient, potential clinical trial participant, that you have all the information you need to be able to make that decision, and the best decision for yourself is paramount in this part of the trial process. Then we go through screening. So you've consented. We start now conducting some of the assessments to assess whether it is safe for you to start on a clinical trial. So they will check, often scan results, histology results, some bloods, just to make sure that you fit into what the trial team have considered, a cohort that is safe to proceed with clinical trial drug. Enrollment and randomization. And so once you've passed that screening process, and not all patients do, and it's important to remember that if you don't pass a screening process, while it can be a bit disappointing, it is within your best interest. There is a reason why they have that screening process in place, to make sure that all the risks are mitigated before you start a clinical trial. So at enrollment, you are officially onto the trial. You've passed, quote unquote, passed the screening period, and then now will be assigned a treatment. Some studies have randomization. So as I mentioned before, some, if it's randomized, a proportion of patients will receive the trial drug, a certain proportion will receive standard of care. Some studies will have everyone receiving standard of care, and there is no placebo. And then throughout treatment, there are study visits. And so this can be days, weeks, or months apart, depending on the regimen. So, if the chemotherapy is FOLFIRINOX, for instance, that tends to be a little bit more often, every 2 weeks. If it's gemcitabine and nab-paclitaxel, those stretch out a little bit longer. And so essentially throughout this period of study visits, it's assessing the safety and monitoring and making sure that all the information that's required to assess whether a drug is safe, working, and effective is being collected. And then we move into the follow-up period. And here it's wanting to assess how you are doing at the end of the study. So if you finish the treatment, they don't just go, okay, well, thank you for your time. That's it. That's where we leave it. We will follow you up for often years to see how you're going, and to see how this treatment has, if anything, impacted you in a good way or a bad way. And so there will be ongoing appointments or phone calls throughout that period as well. And then lastly, you have completion of the study. And so this is where officially a study is ended. And so for the most part, most clinical trials expect patients to come on, go throughout the clinical trial, receive treatment, and then at a certain point, which depending on what the trial is, they call that is completion. That's when you're considered off trial. Now, it is always written in that if a patient or a participant is responding to the treatment, they don't cut off the trial drug. So please don't be concerned that you get to the end of a clinical trial and you're responding and doing well, and then they're going to take that that drug or device that's working away. So there are always written protocols about what happens in that instance, and they ensure that you have what you need if you're still responding to the treatment. And then lastly, just a few quick tips to reiterate those slides that I've gone through before. Things to think about when you're looking into a clinical trial is, am I eligible? And we talked about some of the key things to look at as to whether you are eligible. Not only eligible right now, but could you be eligible later? The next thing to think about is, what is the phase of the trial? Now, the reason why I say this is there are practical considerations that will apply depending on what the phase of the trial is. For a phase 1 clinical trial, there are a lot more assessments. You're going to be spending a lot of time in the hospital, again, for good reason, but that is something that will impact your day-to-day activities. And so that is something to consider. The next thing to consider is, what is the treatment? Is it a device? Is it a technique? Is it a medication? Is there a potential for a placebo if it is a randomized control treatment? And this needs to fit in with what your goals are and what you want out of this clinical trial. The next question is, where is the clinical trial being run? And so when you go through those registries that we mentioned before, those registries outline clinical trials that are open across the world. You can narrow it down to trials that are open across Australia, and then more specifically, you can go down to your state and location. But this is important because logistically, that is something that you have to consider. You know, if you're having to travel between home and a site that is running a clinical trial and it's, you know, hours away, I don't doubt you'd be willing to do it. That does have logistical implications that you would need to consider, not only for yourself but also your loved ones and your carers. And then, what is the window of opportunity? And I can't emphasize this enough. Ask the question early. We at the Dressati Pancreatic Centre, we have a number of clinical trials running here, and we get phone calls from patients and carers saying, hey, I saw this clinical trial that is open. You know, we're interested. Can we enroll? And then we go through medical history, and that short opportunity of time that I mentioned before has gone. It is not fair and it is incredibly frustrating, but that is really the fact of the matter. Is these studies, because they are so strict in what they want to, you know, what they're wanting to measure and what they're wanting to assess, they have to be quite strict in terms of timeframes and the cohort of patients. And so timing of considering a clinical trial is everything. And then it'd be remiss of me not to reiterate that taking part in a clinical trial is completely voluntary and that you don't have to take part. And even if you do, you can withdraw at any time. And so with that, I just wanted to leave you with my contact details. At our centre, we are there not only to patients who, you know, come through our doors, but if there is any help that we can provide in terms of advice, helping you look through those clinical trial registries, helping you understand whether this study might be right for you, we are always there to assist. And so please don't hesitate to give us a call or send me an email. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Caroline. That was fantastic. So I'd just like to open it up to any questions. I actually have a couple of questions just to start off with, but if anyone in the audience does, please just pop them in the chat box, and we'll get to those in a minute. I just wanted to ask, are there any costs associated with participating in a trial? I know you mentioned travel and you know, there might be different treatment regimes and all this sort of thing. So I just wanted to ask, you know, what kind of impact does that have financially on someone participating?
Yeah, thanks, Sophia. That's a very important question. So with a lot of the trials that are looking at particularly a drug for the most part, all trial visits and anything related to the trial is covered by the trial. So you should not be out of pocket for participating in a clinical trial. That will often include travel. It will include parking. It will include, you know, stays if you need to, if you're traveling from long distances. And so that is something that I think is very important to discuss early in considering the logistics of a clinical trial, whether that is suitable for you. There are also a lot of financial assistance funds out there if, you know, for whatever reason, a certain cost is not covered by a clinical trial that you can access. But for the most part, anything that is related to the clinical trial should be covered.
Okay, that's really good to know. And that would include even people just on the standard of care treatment. Is that right?
Yeah, so it would be, you know, if you're coming in, you're having standard of care treatment, but let's say they're adding something on top, that will be covered. And then if you are just receiving, let's say, placebo standard of care, that is still covered. If you are part of a clinical trial, doesn't matter what you're receiving, you're still considered as part of that clinical trial.
Okay, that's fantastic. Yeah, that's very helpful to know. And my other question was about the travel, but you have already covered that and the financial assistance potential for that as well. So that's really helpful.
Yeah. It's a downside. We would love, and I say we, I see the royal we. I don't mean we as in the centre, but also I think that the pancreatic cancer research and clinical trials consortium in general, we do want more trials to be open more widely, but there really just aren't enough trials out there. You know, I did a quick look earlier today on one of the registries. You know, if you look up breast cancer, and I often use breast cancer as an example because that's where my training was, there were, how many were there? 137 clinical trials for breast cancer open in Australia at the moment. For pancreatic cancer, there are 34. And so you can see that vast difference. And so undoubtedly with 34 trials run across Australia, there's going to be space in between that if you find yourself between sites, you're going to have to travel between. But the teams are very cognizant of that, and usually we'll have processes in place where we can assist you with that travel if needed.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for today. Just leave a couple of seconds in case anyone wants to put a question in the Q&A box. But I think we might be good. You did cover everything. So, but if anyone does have any questions after the webinar, oh, here we go. Here's a question come through. Are participants in the trials informed in the placebo cohort? And if so, can they opt out or seek to be in the active treatment arm if they want to benefit from that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. For the most part, when there is a placebo, you usually won't know if you have a placebo, because there really are, the placebo effect, while it's strange, it is real. And so they're wanting to really have an idea of whether, without anyone else knowing, and usually this means that the pharmacist is the only person who knows because they have to dispense the drug, but even the investigator, the doctors, the study team don't know. And so for all intents and purposes, no one knows who is receiving placebo or the active drug. And so, yeah, there are ways around it if you feel like you aren't. And sometimes certain drugs, for instance, especially in hematology where I did some research, certain drugs had very obvious side effects. Right. And so people knew pretty quickly whether they had, what they felt like was the active treatment or not. And so, there are those aspects that you can consider. But for the most part, when they are running clinical trials that are randomized to control and placebo, no one but the pharmacist knows who's receiving what.
Yeah, that's a really important question. And thank you for that. Yeah, if there's any other questions, we will answer those now. Otherwise, yeah, as I was saying, if anyone has any questions after the webinar, please feel free to contact us. You can contact me, or you can contact Caroline directly. She had her information up there, and we'll make sure that we pass those questions on to her if you come to us too. So, yeah, we might finish there. But again, thank you so much, Caroline. I really appreciate all the information and taking us through all of those details as well, and the registries that as you say, can get very complicated. And yeah, we often suggest that people, if they don't understand those criteria, just take them to your doctor and have a chat about that, or contact the study team as well, and just sort of understand how those might align with your situation as well.
Absolutely. Having those conversations, it's always hard bringing something to your treating doctor, but I think having those conversations early is really important. So whether it be your treating team, whether it be the trial team, having those conversations, I think, is the first step.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant information and really appreciated. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you everybody who attended today. Really appreciate you taking your time out of the day, and hopefully we'll see you at the next one. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.